your greatest leadership challenge is. I'm going to give you a chance to head over there and do that. It is all anonymous, so you're not, unless you put your own details in the answer, it's not going to be something that that I will be seeing. Let's head over there, and I'm going to share the screen there to start seeing some of those answers shortly. Let me make sure I got that option there. See if we can start seeing some of those answers come in. Okay, good. Starting to see some. Yeah, perceived lack of experience, of inexperience. Yeah, age can be a factor. Yeah, influence. Yeah, leading up. Good. Confidence. Yes, you know, so many people I talk to, the word imposter syndrome is one that might relate to that one. Juggling so many tasks. Yeah, so much to do. Being too blunt. Another confidence one. Trying to lead staff who seem arrogant and unteachable. Yeah, teams. Yeah, working with teams. So much to do. Oh, this is fantastic. Experience, yeah. Finances, I'm going to see if I can make sure I scroll this down here a little bit. If we keep getting people adding, getting team to buy in, people think you're being bossy, you're better than them. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate all of this, the sharing. Yeah, COVID, right? Like 2 years ago, who would have thought that would have been one of the greatest leadership challenges? Yeah, confidence, imposter syndrome, resistance of staff. Yeah. Yeah, this is, you know, a lot of these challenges, they're challenges that I come across with leaders from all kinds of industries, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, almost any sector I work with. These are some of the similar challenges that we have. But the key thing really that I love that you're sharing here is that, oh yeah, here's another one, getting everyone in systems on the same page. Yeah, is that leadership can be hard, right? Leadership isn't always easy. Feel free to keep adding answers there if you're still answering. I've been involved in leadership development for a number of years, and I've been involved in nonprofits as well, as was mentioned. I worked about 8 years in nonprofits, including a number of years as kind of the main fundraiser in that time period as well. And you know, I think nonprofits have an extra challenge in some ways in regards to how that works, right? Because oftentimes nonprofits are operating as leaders on minimal resources. Sometimes there's a challenge there. And so it's this desire to do so much and have so much to do, and sometimes not having the funds or the people involved that can help with that as well. And of course, working with boards, as someone just added to the list there as well, can add to the challenge as well. I think that in many ways, nonprofit leaders go through some of the most challenging times, but the good news is that also helps refine nonprofit leaders to be some of the best leaders that I come across as well. So as we share some of our challenges, we're going to talk about some of these as we go through our session today, but you know, I want to encourage you as well in your role, and that you are doing good work and you are going through some hard stuff, and it is hard, but you're going to be learning a lot as you go through it. For myself, as we kind of continue to dig into things here a little bit, let me switch to this share now, back to this screen. This is a picture of me and my family. It's a couple years old. Like I said, I've been involved in nonprofit leadership. I also have launched this company called Cantera Leadership back in 2019 to help leaders, teams, organizations become better and doing what they need to do to enhance their leadership potential, to build their teams in a way that help them be more effective. I live in Winnipeg, so for those of you who in the chat earlier were talking about how cold they were, come on, never try to compare coldness with someone from Winnipeg, because it's like we take pride in how cold and snowy and miserable we get in winter. And so yeah, you might be cold, I'm colder. Today, the topic of leadership, I believe it's a really important one, because during times like we're in today, and I don't want to focus a lot just on the pandemic, but you know, leaders need to step up. And it's not just even the pandemic, right? The world we're in is a changing world. We'll talk about that a little bit. And really, we need strong and dynamic leaders now, like right now more than ever, probably. And there's this uncertainty that we're dealing with. And you know, if I would have a nickel for every time a politician says unprecedented in the last couple of years, you know, I could probably help fund most of your organizations in many ways, right? Because it comes up so often. as we are talking about leadership, there's all these different things that come up as challenges, right? And actually, there's some research that's been done around the most common challenges worldwide for leaders, and I'll actually share some of those here with you, to kind of continue to dig into what they might be. And most of these came up with, or you came up with in some of your answers, right? So 6 common challenges that they found in countries all over the world for leaders. So developing managerial effectiveness. So how do you manage well, right? Some of that is regards to how much you have on your plate, the people you have, just kind of making sure the right stuff gets done. Another challenge, inspiring others, right? How do you point towards something greater than the task at hand? And how do you inspire them towards performance, the people around you? Developing employees, right? Some of you mentioned that aspect in there, which relates really closely to the next one as well. Leading a team. How do you lead your team effectively? How do you get the best from your team? Guiding change. Change is inevitable. The last 2 years has been filled with lots of change. Change has always been inevitable. And how do you guide it in a way that gets people on board? And this one here, one of you mentioned, board, managing internal stakeholders in politics. And I think that when we look at trying to navigate the different expectations, the different pressures, the struggles with communication between different stakeholders, as leaders, we get often stuck in the middle, and we don't always nail it right? Sometimes we make mistakes. That's part of what leadership is as well. We're not going to get it perfectly every time, and that just adds to it as well. So as leaders, how we navigate some of these challenges are important, and we're navigating those in the midst of, to me, what is, and I mentioned earlier, some of the most unique times of leadership that we've ever seen. And some of the things that I point to when I'm talking with leaders, one of them is the way that our culture has changed, our society has changed, the generational gap that we're dealing with. And I use that term generational gap, not necessarily because there's a gap, but because the gap is being lived out in the workplace differently than it's ever has been, in the sense that, for sure, most workplaces have at least 4 generations within the workplace, and in some places, even 5 generations. When you look at the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, all those different kinds of things, right? And so from the perspective of building a team, the differences between most likely 4 generations provides challenges, and sometimes 5 generations. The generation Alpha, the next one that's coming up, is the best educated generation ever, the most technologically immersed, the wealthiest generation in many ways, and the generation more likely than any in the past century to spend some or all of their childhood in living arrangements without both of their biological parents, right? So even some of those types of things add to our team, because it affects the culture that we're in. And sometimes that, it's not that we know how to handle all these different generations, but we try to navigate that as best we can. Now, thankfully, as we continue to move forward, we know that there's an abundance of leadership resources out there that can be pro and con. We're living in this day and age where you can access, just by searching in Google, leadership, thousands, millions of resources. In fact, if you go to Amazon and just type in the book section, leadership, you get 70,000 results, over 70,000 results in the book section alone around leadership. That doesn't take into consideration all the articles and, of course, webinars like this that attempt to explain something which is often considered more of an art than a science. Mental health challenges. The positive thing here is that mental health, the discussion around mental health has become more and more prominent. But also, especially in the last couple of years, we've seen the rise of mental health challenges. It's been hard to stay happy. Depression rates have risen. Even if you happen to be a nonprofit that works with teenagers, for example, 20% of all teens experience depression before they reach adulthood, and most never receive any treatment. Right? So mental health, the conversation is growing, and that's a healthy thing. But as leaders, we try to figure out how to navigate that. Some of you mentioned some of the challenges of trying to figure out what to do next, right? So the reactive versus the proactive, the urgent versus the important kind of thing. Patrick Lencioni, I'll probably refer to him a couple times today, in his book called The Advantage, says that the single greatest advantage that any company can achieve is organizational health. Yet he goes on to state that very few leaders do anything about it because they feel that they don't have time. So much things that they're working on. And of course, we also live in a wired and wireless world, right? So research has shown that that the rise in mental health challenges also has occurred around the same time as the prevalence of the smartphone, as an example. And so that has affected things. The world we're living in, even according to technology proponents, is changing faster than ever before. And there is a fear and there's a worry that sometimes we as leaders will not be able to adapt fast enough. Technology, world politics, the world's growing smaller every day, right? Because of the way that this all works. And that just relates to some of the challenges that we have to deal with. But there's also positive things to think about, the renewed focus on purpose and people. As nonprofit leaders, you get that, right? Having a purpose, a sense of purpose. And I think more and more organizations are grabbing hold of that. What does it mean to have a purpose in our business? Not just having a business, but having a purpose. How do we build into our people? And a good example of that, and maybe you're part of an organization that has this, organizations are beginning to change even the titles of their HR roles. It used to be that the HR role used to just be called like the HR manager or something like that. But there's organizations that are starting to say, hey, we're going to change it to sound less like official and institutional, and we're going to call those people our head of talent and culture or head of people, to kind of build that warmth into the dynamic of things. And of course, as was mentioned, we're in COVID-19 pandemic. The challenges of COVID-19 are real, right? And it's okay to say that and say that it's real. I know we're probably all a little bit burnt out from COVID and the challenges that have been there and hearing about it, but it's real. And it's been a major factor in most organizations I work with, and probably 100% of you listening in on this would say that it's affected the work that you do. So as we continue to figure out how to navigate that, it's important to recognize that we're in the midst of, oh, sorry, I did the wrong slide there. As leaders, one of our main goals is to how to lead well, how to lead our teams well, how to kind of build teams, build organizations that our impact is able to be stronger because of our leadership. And again, Patrick Lencioni talks about this. He says, not finance, not strategy, not technology. It is teamwork that remains the ultimate competitive advantage, both because it is so powerful and so rare. And I know that you all, especially if you have teams, maybe not all of you have teams, maybe some of you operate your nonprofits on your own. Even if you operate your nonprofit on your own, you probably have a board that is a part of your team in some way. When you value your people, I know you do. Your team are your most important part of your organization in many ways. When you have your team functioning well, your people functioning well, you know, they're serving, they're giving, they're serving the cause that you're trying to influence. And so your people are really important, and you get that. And I really appreciate that. That's one of the key things that I really appreciate about nonprofit leaders, that they have that natural understanding of that. It seems sooner than a lot of people in the corporate world might. So I want to talk a little bit about how we as leaders can become leaders of influence. How we can influence our teams, our stakeholders around us, not just our teams, right, but any of our stakeholders. That could be our donors, that could be our board members, could be our team members, could be the people that we work with as well, as stakeholders or clients, whatever they might be classified as for you. And it's all based on a study that was done a number of years ago. And this is done by Gallup. Some research is done by Gallup. Most people know Gallup as a polling company, and they do a lot of polling in research, but they do a lot of research around leadership development. And they actually work with companies to develop leaders and teams as well. And so back in 2005 through 2008, so this is a while ago, they did a formal study. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to determine the average person's opinion about leadership. So instead of leadership experts or historians or CEOs or celebrities or politicians, instead of talking to them and defining leadership, they went to, I guess, real people. I guess everyone's a real person, but you know what I mean. And people that weren't in those, roles that we might view as being special roles. They gathered information from more than 10,000 individuals, And they asked them to describe a leader that had the most positive influence on their lives daily, and then list 3 words that best described what that person contributed to their life. Right? So that's such an interesting question, right? Describe the leader that has the most positive influence on their lives daily, and 3 words to describe them. And then they studied the 25 most commonly mentioned words. Now, interestingly enough, words like purpose, wisdom, humor, and humility, they weren't near the top of the list. As they studied those 25 words, and I'll share what some of those were shortly, what they were able to do is they compiled those into 4 main categories. And then what they termed them as is what they termed them as their followers' basic needs. And those basic needs were trust, compassion, stability, and hope. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit here. And I'm going to have you ask yourself the question as how do those components show up in your leadership? Trust, compassion, stability, and hope. And can you think of practical ways to build that in your leadership? I think a really good example of this is when I look at the conflict in the Ukraine right now, in Ukraine, and the president of Ukraine and his wife, what they're emulating in their leadership. I don't know much about them other than the fact what we've seen on, through the news and some of the reports that have come out. But when I've been reading about the approach that they're taking, I feel like they, and you can filter what you know of them through these 4 categories as well. I feel like they're emulating them, but we'll go through them and you can see for yourself how it relates to them, but also how it relates to you. So first of all, I want to talk about trust. Okay. So trust, if you define trust in the dictionary, it says trust is the reliance on the integrity, strength, ability, surety, etc. of a person or thing, and that's confidence. So that was pulled from the dictionary. Peter Drucker says leadership is an achievement of trust. When Gallup put their words together, they kind of packaged a few other words within the trust category. And they use the words honesty, integrity, and respect. Leaders who build trust are leaders that others can find reliably consistent. It's hard to inspire trust if you are volatile or unpredictable. Now, some of that has to do with how you follow through, right? So if you're a trustworthy leader, you're going to follow through on the things that you said you're going to do. But also, it's important to remember that follow through isn't all, right? Followers want leaders that are honest. Do it honestly. Don't just do what you're supposed to do, but do it honestly. In addition, you need to show trust to others in order to gain trust back. So how well do you trust those around you? Do you release the things that you can release? Sometimes as leaders, we struggle to be able to let things go and let others take over. I will again refer to Patrick Lencioni. He talks about trust as being able to know how someone will react in a given situation, but more importantly, he highlights vulnerability-based trust for leaders to strive towards. So being open and vulnerable helps build that foundation with your team. So that's things like authenticity, vulnerability, words that might be a little bit of cliche words in some ways, but the truth of them still stands. As leaders, we need to build trust. We need to build trust by being human, being vulnerable. Now, we don't have to be the ones who have it all together. In tough times, it's really okay to be authentic with your own challenges that you have. So a good question you might want to ask yourself as you consider trust is, how can you be more open and authentic with those around you? This relates directly to some of those points that some of you put in earlier in what your greatest challenge is, the imposter syndrome side of things, right? As leaders, we think we need to have it all together. We need to have it all figured out, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes as leaders, it's okay to say, hey, this is hard. This is hard right now. And people will value you for that. So spend a moment just thinking of that. How can you be more open and authentic? Or maybe how can you just be a leader who emulates trust? I'm going to give you a practical thing that you can try with your teams. So this is an exercise that is pulled from Patrick Lencioni's material, a trust exercise. And some of you, maybe this is something that is almost too simple because some of your teams are really already have a strong trust dynamic. But even think of this in regards to working with your board. Maybe you haven't done this with your board, but Patrick Lencioni really recommends this to help build, to give members an opportunity to demonstrate vulnerability in a low risk way, right? So when you can demonstrate vulnerability in a low risk way and help team members understand one another at this fundamental level, it really helps to avoid making false attributions about behavior and intentions, which is where trust usually breaks down, right? Because we start to tell stories about each other that aren't always true, and then we can't trust necessarily as easily. So this is an exercise that he encourages people to go through, where they just take a few minutes within a small group to do this. So he talks about just simple questions, okay? And it's just 3 simple questions to share. So where did you grow up? How many siblings did you have, and where did you fall in that order? And please describe a unique or interesting challenge or experience from your childhood. So an interesting exercise, not really like rocket science to go through this, but just imagine having that conversation in an intentional moment. So maybe you have a new team member, or you're trying to, maybe you're the new team member, you're just joining an organization in a leadership role of some sort. I'd encourage you to consider having this as a part of your next meeting that you have. Say, we're going to do a quick, and you can say it's from a Patrick Lencioni exercise around building trust, because trust is the foundation of team development. So we're going to do an exercise that helps us do that. Here's 3 questions that we can go through. And it just gives a nice, safe little thing. And you hear some interesting stories. I've done this a few different times, and you get to hear some interesting things about people that maybe you didn't ever really know. You might know where they grew up, maybe. You probably in many situations don't really know how many siblings they might have, but then hearing a unique or interesting challenge or story from their childhood gives an interesting way to get to know someone. So I'm curious if you do try that, how it all works for you. I'm going to move on to the next element, which is compassion. So compassion, Gallup use some additional words there as well. They talk about caring, friendship, happiness, love. Now, these are some very high standards, right, to achieve, but these are vitally important for leaders to become better at. Now, what it doesn't mean that you need to be everyone's best friend, but people do need to know that they're more than a number. Now, you might become friends, you might become really good friends, but the point of it isn't so much that that's the end goal. The end goal is to show that you care. To show that they're an important piece of your team. And again, as nonprofit leaders, this is probably one where you excel at naturally in many ways. But how are you being intentional about it is a good question. And some of that is just how you pour into people's lives, right? So what do you do with your team? Do you take the time to do that? I know we're crazy busy, and for some of you, you're like, Ben, I got so much I need to do already. How can I do these kind of things? It might be just taking small chunks of time, one piece of your day, a small piece, and just doing something. Gallup has done a bunch of research around this, and what they have found is that if someone at work is able to respond to this following statement, my supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. If they can respond to that in the affirmative, those team members are more engaged, more productive, more profitable, have higher customer engagement or donor engagement, depending on what role they might have, and they stay with the company longer. Right? So we need to be willing to pour into lives of those around us, especially as we work virtually. This is an additional challenge. If you are working virtually, some of you probably still are, don't forget about the power of being personal, even over a virtual call. Plan on the first few minutes of every conversation and being more on a personal touch-based time. In fact, leave more time for it now because of everything that we've been going through. And also, being personal is okay. So like try to think of creative ways that tie into how you can be personal with someone. So as an example, if you know that someone really appreciates cats, I don't know, I'm not a cat guy. Let's just assume someone on your team really appreciates cats. Maybe a little cat gift package. I don't know what that would even look like. So, I mean, apologies if you're a cat person and I'm really butchering what you might appreciate, but that shows that you care, right? Where you personalize the contact, the gift, the appreciation that you show in some way. It's super helpful. The other aspect of compassion is recognizing the role of communication. Now, if you take any relationship, let's say if you're someone who's married, you have a partner, even a close friend, if you're not communicating with them, it's really hard for them to feel like you care. And in general, leaders overestimate how good they are at communicating. The studies come back time and time again. Leaders say, hey, yeah, are you a good communicator? Most of them, rate themselves decently. When they ask team members, hey, is your leader a good communicator? Most of them give a lower rating to how their leaders communicate. So how are you communicating with your team? That's a good question for you to consider. Are you communicating enough details? Are you communicating enough about what's going on? Are you helping them to feel like they're connected with the important things that they need to be connected with? So a good question to ask yourself when you think of compassion is this: how can you be creative in showing care and compassion to those around you today? And maybe it's not even being creative. Maybe it's just, how can you do that? Maybe it's taking that extra moment as you walk down the hall to just pop your head in one of the offices of someone on your team and just say, hey, how things going with, whatever it is that you know about them, or how's your weekend? Those kind of questions can, they might seem like that's a little bit like filler questions. So, you might have to figure out what question works best for you and your team. But the main thing is being intentional about compassion. I'm going to move to stability as our next one here. So for Gallup, when they did the research, they identified some other words within this bucket: security, strength, support, and peace. While it's important for companies to be growing and dealing with change and expanding, there's also this need to offer stability and confidence to our teams, and not just to our teams, to any stakeholders. Sometimes change and growth, while valuable, can also make people feel unstable and insecure. Stability in many ways relates mostly to how to knowing that they'll be able to handle the here and now, right? So the here and now is really what stability is trying to point to. So for some of that could be something like, hey, I just, a stable paycheck, a stable job, it's, that kind of thing. It could relate to something like, hey, just having a stable workplace without crazy drama within the workplace where lots is changing and lots is happening. This may not be super easy to do, right? Because it's hard to know, especially with the last couple of years, how stable we can provide things in a workplace these days. But at least having that as a key priority and a key value in how you lead is going to make a difference, right? At least acknowledging your desire to provide that stability will help people be like, hey, like, I get it. This is an important factor for my leader. This is an important factor for what I want. I'm going to feel more stable because of that, more supported. The term carry your own weather is one that I've come across in regards to leadership, and it relates to stability. The basic idea behind this is that as a leader, you need to develop this ability to have your weather, which is your emotions and reactions, not spill out into other lives, and vice versa, not let other emotions, weather, spill into yours. Now, I don't mean that you need to be stoic and never have emotions, but you need to be able to understand the role that your weather plays in your role as a leader. Is your weather predictable or is it not? 70% chance of what? 80% chance of what? Can you have that ability to carry your own weather? Which kind of can contradict a little bit to that idea of being vulnerable, but yet it's carrying both. It's balancing it, right? Because there's still a need to be transparent, because actually stability and transparency go hand in hand as well. It might seem like it's a paradox, but it's not really. It's holding them both with understanding the value of both. Now, at least in a basic sense, transparency is important, right? So of course, there's things that everyone in the organization can't know or shouldn't know. But when employees feel confident in what they know of their role, their job, their organization, they're going to feel more at peace. So transparency helps them feel peace. You might feel like, some of the things, details you might want to, that would relate to transparency might be too much detail, or might be like details that would make them feel unstable. But yet when they know what the problems are, it actually helps them feel like, hey, they got this figured out. They have a plan working together. And that's where it just helps to reassure them, to reassure others of your commitment, your care, that you understand how your leadership and how your organization can play a role in their lives and helping them feel at peace. And I mentioned this in the last one, but I'm going to mention it here. I'm going to mention it 3 times because this one here is probably one of the biggest factors in regards to stability. Communicate, communicate, communicate. One of the factors here is when you're able to communicate around organizational goals and around kind of how things have been going, and whether it's short-term goals or long-term goals, it helps people to see, hey, like this is where we're at. And if you're changing focus because something happens, right? Like a curveball is thrown your way. All of a sudden we've got COVID, or we've got, something goes wrong with your tech, or something, something goes wrong in some way. And you have to change focus, change direction, change plans. One of your major stakeholders of some sort, there's an issue there and you need to change plans. It's how you communicate about it provides that stability. Because most of the time people know, like people on your team know if there's something that is a challenge that's out there. But if you're not talking about it, they're going to feel like insecure in all that time. And one of the things that I encourage people to think of is, especially in times of change, is this term called a rallying cry. And Patrick Lencioni talks about that. And he talks about a rallying cry being this kind of source of stability for team members, for employees, because the rallying cry becomes what it's almost like this goal, this short-term goal that just helps kind of rally people around whatever the challenge is that's in front of them. So especially during times of challenge, it's okay to say, hey, we've got this challenge, but hey, we're going to have this rallying cry that means over the next 4 weeks, we're going to reach this great goal, whatever that goal might be for your organization, reach this many donations or whatever the case is, because now our donors, our donor numbers are short. So we're gonna have this rallying cry that in the next 4 weeks, we're gonna raise X amount of dollars, and it's gonna draw us together and provide some of that stability. So good question for you to consider is, what can you do to show and communicate stability to your stakeholders? I'm actually going to give you a fillable PDF worksheet shortly that you can use around some of this too. Hope. We all like to have hope. Hope is probably, I'm not sure, I wouldn't call it the most important factor out of these 4, but it's probably one of the ones that can drive the emotional side of things for a team in a positive way the most. And Gallup uses other words in there: guidance, faith, direction. In a sense, again, remember, filtering this through what followers want from their leaders, what people want from their leaders. So they want guidance. They want to have faith that your direction that you're going makes sense, that it fits for them. The stability is kind of that in the moment, right? Are we okay now? But hope is the one that kind of points towards the future. Where are we going? What does that look like for us? And I think that that's where leaders, and this is from the Harvard Business Review, I'll read a quote from them, that for them, they have to strike this ability. Well, I'll read the quote. It says, leaders need to intentionally pull back, opening your mental aperture to take in the midground and background. It is what we call meta leadership, taking a broad, holistic view of both challenges and opportunities. Properly focused meta leadership fosters well-directed management. So it's sometimes being able to take yourself out of the here and now, the chaos, the fires that are on your desk all the time, and just be able to step back a little bit and say, hey, what's the big picture? When's the last time I've thought big picture? When's the last time I've communicated big picture? And then as a leader, being able to paint that picture The Wikipedia definition for hope is one that I really like. It says, hope is an optimistic state of mind that is based on an expectation of positive outcomes with respect to events and circumstances in one's life or the world at large. Right? So that optimistic state of mind. So do you have a communicated hope, a communicated vision might be a way that you might view it. And are you able to carry that vision and communicate that vision? When's the last time you took time to do that? I love this Stockdale paradox. If you've ever read the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great, he talks about the Stockdale paradox. And James Stockdale is a former vice presidential candidate. And in the midst of challenge and trial, James Stockdale took a unique approach. And this was during the Vietnam War. He was held captive as a prisoner of war for over 7 years. And during that time period, of course, it would have been horrific. He was repeatedly tortured. He had no reason to believe he'd make it out alive, but held in the clutches of the grim reality of that world, of that hell world, as Jim Collins writes. This is what Jim Collins says. He found a way to stay alive by embracing both the harshness of the situation with a balance of healthy optimism. Stockdale explained this idea as the following: you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. In the most simplest explanation of this paradox, this is again Jim Collins saying this, it is the idea of hoping for the best, but acknowledging and preparing for the worst. The ability to acknowledge your situation and balance optimism with realism comes from an understanding of the Stockdale paradox. So balancing that optimism with realism, right? And really that's, as you're moving your organization forward, you're providing that vision for your donors even to try to kind of get on board with where you want to go as an organization and the impact you want to make. It's being able to provide that hope for them, for your team. So we need to walk that line carefully, whether there's challenges on our horizon or not. We know that challenges will come. It's being able to be clear on where we're going to provide that hope. And of course, proactive leadership versus reactive leadership. We talked about that a little bit already, but the idea of getting beyond the fires of the moment and spending some of that time being in future thinking and getting to the point where you can be proactive. Response mode is easier, right? The reactive mode, because it's clearly defined, but hope is harder to wrap your head around, and instilling hope in those around you in the midst of difficulties or in the midst of normal times. That's really where we want to try to be more proactive in doing so. So that's a really key factor of it all. And of course, we talked about vision as well. What's the vision that you have, and how are you able to communicate it? So there, as you think about it, how are you providing hope to your stakeholders? It's a question for you to consider. What's something that you can do, this week that just reminds people of that? Reminds people of the vision of the organization, the vision of the work you're doing. Especially we as leaders, we often are so caught up in doing the work, we sometimes forget how amazing the work we're doing actually is, right? And so we kind of feel like, hey, let's make sure we're communicating that and reminding people and reminding ourselves sometimes of that as well. So I know I've thrown a lot at you here today in regards to these 4 principles, and hopefully I've gotten you thinking a little bit. But I want to, encourage you though, right? I want to encourage you that your role, now some of you are senior leaders, some of you are junior leaders, some of you might feel like you're not a leader, but I feel like everyone can be a leader, and you can all lead, whether you're leading up, leading out, whatever the case is. And I want to encourage you, because you don't need to get all these perfectly. You don't need to be the perfect leader. That just feeds the imposter syndrome. What you need to do is be willing to just take a step. Everyone that I work with, every leader out there, myself, everyone, we have a gap between where we're at and where we can be, where we want to be, where we see ourselves going. And if we can just take one small step to bridge that gap, we're making progress. And that's huge. And Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, before he wrote the book, he was working with his team, and he told his team, okay, I want you to go and research successful businesses and organizations out there. Research a bunch of organizations and come back and tell me why they were successful. But before he sent them out, he told the team, he said, but whatever you do, don't come back and tell me that the answer to why they're successful is leadership. because like that's just cliche. I don't want to get that as the answer. So they came back to him, and the guy who's reporting said, I hate to tell you, Jim, but guess what? The answer is leadership. And what it points to is the excitement that there is to be a leader, because there's so much that you can do to influence your team, your organization, the outcomes that you're striving towards. And really, Jim Collins said, he said it all begins with leadership. So I want to make it a little more practical for you, right? I've asked you a bunch of these different questions and kind of pointed towards a lot of different things, but I want to give you a few practical things. So now what, right? So, take a breath, right? Like, it's okay. Take a breath. Be excited about the things we're talking about. Don't let it be like, oh, like all this weight of Ben giving me all these things to think about and do. No, just take a breath. Okay. As you go from here, what else can you do? Practice active listening with your team. This relates to the communication side of things. Practice more effective communication. If that's all you do, if you just take a breath today and just go and be a better listener, better communicator, things like trust, compassion, stability, and hope are all going to improve. But, as I said earlier, even if that isn't what you do, take one thing from what we talked about here today and just implement that one thing. Say, hey, I want to become better at building trust, so I'm going to go do that trust exercise that Ben talked about. Or I'm going to, try to show more compassion, so I'm going to write a little note of encouragement to one team member every week. Something like that. Just do one thing. So what is that one thing? And I always encourage leaders to schedule intentional leadership blocks in their calendars. And the reason why I do this is exactly what I've been talking about, where we always have this, so many fires to put out. There's so much time to do lots of things that it's hard to take the time to be a little more intentional. So what I encourage people to do is just take 10 minutes, put a block in your calendar and call it your intentional leadership block. 10 minutes once a week. Start with once a week. And in that 10 minutes, ask yourself, how am I building trust, compassion, stability, and hope? How am I leading my team effectively? What one thing can I do today in that 10-minute window to lead my team, to engage my stakeholders, to lead myself more effectively? I often, and if you want to do this now as you're listening, I encourage you to do so. I often encourage people to actually write, as I present this, take their phones out or open up their calendar on their computer and schedule a recurring 10-minute window into their calendar once a week. Call it their intentional leadership time. So if you want to do that, I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to think of, as you are working through this, trust, compassion, stability, and hope. I have a fillable PDF. I'm going to pop a link into the chat, and I think that it's going to get sent to you as well with the recording. But if you want to grab this right away, this should work here. And you can just take that, download it. Hopefully that works for you. Well, I gotta send it to everyone. I didn't send it to everyone. Oh, okay, there we go. You should be able to access that. You should be able to fill that out. And really, I have just said stakeholder group 1, 2, etc. For you, it might be, your donors might be one, your team might be one, your board might be one, those stakeholder groups. And just between them, you might have slightly different things that you want to do to kind of help build that. So encourage you to fill that out as we go a little bit on that as well. And I'll use a quote from Ken Blanchard. He says, the key to successful leadership is influence, not authority. So we're not leaders because we can boss people around and they'll do what we say, but we're leaders because we want to influence and grow. So as we get close to wrapping up here, there's a couple things. Well, one thing I'll encourage you to do is I'm going to go to the next Menti option here. So you should be able to go to that same link, that Menti link, enter in that same number, or just it should have switched on your screen, which asks the question, what is one action step you want to take to be a stronger leader of influence? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as we kind of wrap up our session here together. So I'll leave that up for a little bit longer, and I'm going to pop up a recommended resource list as well as an infograph shortly. Head to that, menti.com 4142-9998. No. So as some of you fill that out, I'll review some of those shortly. I'll flip to that screen, but as you do that, here, we'll just actually menti.com. I'm going to put the number in the chat here, 9998. And then I can switch to a different screen here. Some recommended resources. I've referred to some of these: The Advantage, Patrick Lencioni, Strengths-Based Leadership, that by Tom Rath. That's that study that I was talking about. Crucial Conversations. If you're ever trying to get better at handling hard conversations like conflict or other conversations, that's a great book to take a look at. This one I have on here. I know we haven't talked about any kind of like marketing or anything like that, but it's Building a Story Brand. I've been really impressed with Donald Miller's approach to how to build your brand in a way, your story brand, using story to market yourself. And I'm also a big fan of building teams using the CliftonStrengths assessments and reports. That's put out by Gallup. It's used in 90% of the Fortune 500, but it also is used in many other organizations that aren't Fortune 500. I work with many of them myself, and I use that for a tool that helps build leaders and teams. So if you're curious, you can check that out as well. And I want to share with you this infograph that I also have for you. And I'm going to pop this in the chat. This one I think is going to everyone as well. If you want to get a quick summary, I know some of you might have taken just great notes throughout our whole time together. And you might have been like, Ben, you should have shared this at the beginning, but then maybe you wouldn't have taken such great notes and listened as carefully. So this is available for you. You can download that and print it off, put it on your wall if you want. Just kind of sums up some of the things that we talked about from our time here together today. I'm going to shortly flip back to that Menti screen just to see what people have been putting in there. But just want to thank you for being a part of this. I do these kind of things because I love helping out, especially nonprofits. But if you do, so I'm not doing it to kind of put my name out there. If you do want to find out more about what I do, just send me an email, reach out to me on LinkedIn, whatever the case is. Totally open to make those connections. Even if you don't want to hear more about the stuff I do or whatever, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love building my network, especially with nonprofit leaders. I love doing that as well. Let me switch the screen share over to that Menti, and here see some of the action items are that people have identified here. Yeah, so we've got a few of them shared. Good. Become more confident and take more workshops to keep learning. Good. Yeah, improve listening. You know, that's a tough one. I struggle with that, and I'm a coach. I coach people, and I still struggle with that. Provide more intention in communicating with team members. Yeah, good. More focus on compassion and being personal. Act on how I came across to my team. Inspire more trust. Yeah, you know, like to me, the biggest thing that leaders can do is just self leadership, self-awareness, and self-growth. And so, really appreciate all your answers there. Being willing to address that gap. Don't let the gap discourage you. Let the gap encourage you. That gives you an opportunity to grow more. The gap, right? So as we bridge the gap never goes away. There's always a gap. So thanks again, everyone. I think